Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 3 in our course here. And today, some of the things that we're going to look about are kind of some of the early history of race and slavery in the United States before it became the United States and after it became the United States. I kind of doing this, kind of, seeing how far we get each time, trying to make each lecture, roughly about an hour and a half or so to replace what would be Tuesday, Thursday course. So some of the things to kind of look at here: transatlantic slave trade, slavery in the United States, political divide over slavery, Missouri Compromise, and we might even make it up to the Compromise of 1850. Now, here's one of the things that I think we have to realize is that African slaves were brought to the Americas. So it wasn't just a thing with where we are now in the United States, or what we kind of know later as British North America. This was something that I'll show you in the next slide, was very widespread. So they were the first African slaves were brought to the Western world long before they arrived in British North America in 1619. So the first Africans actually arrived were by Columbus in 1498 in what is now the Dominican Republic. But it was somewhat unclear whether they were free or slaves, because one of the things that Columbus and the Spanish did is that the Taino people that were already there on the island of Hispaniola, most of them were worked to death or died of disease. So they didn't kill everybody there. And if you've ever been to the Dominican Republic, and I've been to the Dominican Republic a few times, including just earlier this year, significant other and I went to Punta Cana, which very nice resort, which we really didn't leave. But I've been there before, including have been around Santo Domingo and been in the northern part of the country, Puerto Plata, and Santiago, and in a lot of different places. And, one of the things that you see from the Dominican people is that there still is a large amount of descendants of Italiano people within the population. But of course, one of the things that you saw, and you still see in a large number of Latin American countries, is some type of social strata based on race and ethnicity, where to a large degree, still many Latin American countries today, often the leaders that you see are not do not represent the population as much as a whole, but more the people that are much more the descendants of the Spanish, instead of those more people that are not just of European lineage. But the first large number of African slaves were brought to the Americas by Portugal and Spain in what we kind of know as the first Atlantic system. So this kind of eventually revolves into kind of we know as the triangle. Go from Europe to Africa over to the Americas. Largely at the time it was more in the Caribbean, and then back to Europe. So some of the things that were brought back to Europe, like rum. I'm sure some of you might have had rum before. It's a tasty drink made from sugar cane. So it was an exchange of goods, but you have to remember that at the time people were considering, when they talked about goods and property, they were also including humans as slaves. So this is not to say that slavery just started then. Of course, we know that it's existed before recorded history and across the world. And in fact, while it is formally banned in every country in the world, the last country actually to ban slavery was in 1984 in Mauritania, and it still exists. It still exists there. Um, and I think we know that it exists in other forms. So, when we're talking about human trafficking, um, but this was legalized slavery. So, in what we know as the United States, the first African slaves did not actually, in formally what we know as the United States today, did not actually land in 1619. They actually arrived a little bit sooner in Spanish Florida. So in Florida is actually where that existed first. So as you can see here, these are some of the areas that a large number of slaves came from. So a lot of kind of West Africa. And the reason, if you can just kind of think of a map here, let's actually look at a map here. It was a lot easier than going to East Africa. So some of this was being done because of some convenience. But the reason that I want to show you this is that while a large number of slaves came to British North America, that was not the largest number. So as you can see, if you look over on the African side, you see some kind of over Madagascar and southeastern Africa, quite a few, over 500,000. But the biggest chunk that you're seeing there is coming from West Central Africa. And then other places kind of as you kind of get into the bend of Africa there on the Atlantic Ocean. And if you start looking there, well, where do a lot of them end up? Not that much in the United States, frankly. Over time, you can see that some actually are not actually coming into British North America. Some are coming more towards French and Spanish controlled territory there where it says Gold Coast. But you see a giant amount of Africans that were put into slavery. Look at the large number coming into the Caribbean, and especially into Brazil. So Brazil actually abandoned slavery a little bit after the United States does. But I think the important thing to remember when we're thinking about this, when you just people just throw around the term slave, which it is a term. I think some people sometimes forget we're talking about human beings. Human beings that are taken from their home, put on ships, many of which didn't survive going across the Atlantic Ocean. And, one of the sad things is that this was actually factored in as basically the cost of doing business, that not everybody was going to make it. That, okay, we're going to put 300 people on a ship. We're going to basically stick you in the bowels of the ship, shackle you and chain you, have you in squalid conditions. And we figure, what, if quite a few of you die, we don't really care, as long as we can make a profit. But one of the big things that I kind of wanted to show you this is just the legacy of what this has done to the population. How many slaves that were brought into the Caribbean. So, if you just start thinking about that, and you think a little bit, as far as if you've been to some Caribbean nations, you see the legacy of this as far as the population. You see the legacy of slavery if you're in some parts of the American South, as far as the population. But just think about that. When you're looking at these numbers, when you see something like 5,695,000, those are 5,695,000 people. some of whom are going to die going across the Atlantic, some of which are just going to be worked to death once they get to places, because you had such a robust slave trade that that frankly the people that were running the plantations figured, it's the cost of doing business. And that's kind of a sad thing when you start thinking about that, when you're thinking about individual human beings. But you can see very few went to Europe. Most of this was going to the Caribbean and Brazil, what we now know as Brazil. Now, what about the United States as we know it? So, the United States formally declares its independence, as we know, in 1776. Now, one of the things that I did kind of want to bring up is that, I know we've seen some things. I'm thinking about the last time that I taught this, literally a year ago. We've had the 1619 Project, and then people are talking about critical race theory. And, you've had some pushback where where certain state legislatures are trying to ban that. Am I trying to do that? No. What I'm trying to do is simply present history to you and how that has worked into our society today. So that's my big thing. So, one of the things that the 1619 Project, a lot of it's based on, is that is the thought that, we think of 1776 as being the most important date, but is 1619 also not another really important date? Maybe even more important. Because of this, how much of the United States was built upon slavery? And the answer is quite a bit. Slaves were used a lot for cotton. You just start thinking, well, what did they do with that cotton? Some of it went over to Europe, but was some of it not going to factories in the north? Sure. Was this the capital? Were certain buildings in Washington, D.C. built by slaves? Yes. So, was it not an important part of British North America and later the United States? And the answer is yes. I think those are things that you can't really deny. And I don't know why some people want to deny them. Now, I think that some people might want to question how much. Maybe you do that. But if you're just saying, we shouldn't be thinking about that, I think you're kind of whitewashing things a little bit there. So, where did the first African slaves come? What we now know as Virginia, into the Jamestown colony. But the British, French, and Dutch in the Second Atlantic System brought far more slaves, as you can see, into the Caribbean. So, as you can see there, into what we kind of know as the United States, about 500,000 total. Caribbean, 4.5 million. Brazil, 5 million. So, they wanted the slaves, and after they had, kind of went through some of the native people that they wanted to enslave, things like sugar, tobacco, other really intensive agricultural areas. So, some of the other things that some of the slave plantations would grow in the United States: rice, indigo, in addition to sugar and tobacco. But the biggest one was cotton. Eventually was cotton. Because I'm going to show you some things about picking cotton a little bit later. Cotton is not something that is that fun to pick. I've never picked it myself. Have I tobacco? Oh, yes, I have. Even though I've been around it enough that I never wanted to smoke either. So with the big supply, there was little incentive to provide a lot of humane treatment or nutrition, meaning that especially in the Caribbean and in Brazil, a very high mortality rate. So one of the things that this also brings in as well was chattel slavery. So you're probably thinking, well, what do I mean by chattel slavery? And probably some of you know exactly what I mean by chattel slavery. That is that if the slaves also have children, those children are slaves too, to be owned by the master of the mother. Now, I know one of the things in 2020, I always think it's a good thing to sometimes stay off Facebook because people put so many silly things on there. The first slave owner in British America was not black. Slavery in the New World was largely race based. Were there some instances where you did have this occur? Yes. Some of it was much more in Louisiana because of some strange things that kind of with society there that were different than much of the rest of the country. But this was very much largely race based because if you just think about it, it wasn't like you were bringing a lot of slaves from Europe over here. It was from Africa. So 10 to 15 million people, largely from West Africa, coming this way. Now, slaves coming to America, it was very dangerous and often deadly. Conditions were not good, and you often would have slave revolts on board. And you just think about it. It's not like ships were made as well as they are now, and they didn't exactly move that fast. You only have so much supplies that you have, and one of the things is when you're surrounded by water and you're out in the ocean, it's not exactly water that you can drink because it's salt water. So to prevent revolts, slaves were often confined to the lower parts of the ships, often being chains, segregated often by age and gender, required to stay in the same place at all times, horrible conditions of hygiene, large mortality rate. But this was factored in, as I said, the cost of doing business. Now, a little more on chattel slavery. A person is owned permanently for their entire life. Absent some other type of arrangement, the offspring becomes property as well. So it's kind of hereditary slavery. So this also means as property, you can be bought and sold. I mean, just think about that. It's something that we haven't had in the United States since 1865, 13th Amendment. But just think about that. Owning a person. Now, I know sometimes people kind of use the term kind of flippantly, but think about it literally. You actually can own a person. You can do what you want to with them. You can sell them. When you die, your relatives can inherit the person. You can try to get the person to make new people that also become your property. Now, I want to tell you this differs from something that we know as indentured servitude. So one of the things that I saw last year, floating around Facebook and the internet, was this thing about Irish slavery ignored. Now, if there's anybody that probably is not going to want to ignore Irish slavery if you had it, it's probably me, if you could tell from my first and last names. I probably have the most Irish name that you could possibly think of, other than maybe, as my dissertation advisor said, I have the most Irish name other than Conor O'Dwyer. So, they were indentured servants. Indentured servitude was a way that a number of people got over into the New World. And what this means is that you would have service for a specific period of time. Usually it was around 5 years, sometimes it was 7 years, then you would be free by law. So it's basically kind of that's the way you were paying your way to get over here. So there were not a large number of Irish slaves in the New World. And later, the thing is, my people were coming over here because they were starving to death on coffin ships. Didn't know if we were going to make it to New York or Boston or wherever we're coming to. But not slavery. Something that's a little bit different. So, some of the diverging paths of slavery. So, what all of the original 13 colonies had slavery at some point. But that's not to say that all 13 colonies had a lot of slaves. You know, the further you went north, the less prevalent slavery was. Because one of the big things was with slavery was that slaves were being used much more in agriculture. Now, did you have slaves in other parts of the country and in the South as well that were used as outside of agriculture? Well, of course you did. But agriculture was one of the primary reasons that people desired slaves. So slavery moves, however, later into an institution that's largely concentrated in the South and kind of the southern part of the mid-Atlantic. So the intensive type of agriculture, so rice, tobacco, indigo, sugar, but cotton really takes off after the cotton gin. Because if you've ever actually seen cotton growing, and we don't grow as much cotton in the United States as we used to. There are other parts of the world that grow it as well. One of the things is that when you try to actually pick it, it would scratch you because it is a lot of, it's almost like trying to like you're picking roses or something. So it scratches you, and also it's very labor intensive to pick, and then you would have to get these things out of it. Like seeds and stuff. So once you had the ability to kind of separate the seeds with the cotton gin, it made it where it was just not as much, as not as difficult. So it made sense to grow a lot more cotton. And the thing is, it's still very labor intensive to pick and grow. So, well, guess what? If you want to grow more cotton, and the United States starts spreading further west after the American Revolution, well, new land opened up because basically there were a lot of people there. You just kind of, there were treaties that were broken over time, and later you get the Indian Removal Act. So you get a lot of new territory, and especially you have the Louisiana Purchase as well. So, you have more land. So there is a desire to have more slaves. So one of the things is in the Northeast, agriculture was just a lot different. And the other thing is Puritans in New England abhorred slavery, which had a very limiting effect in that area. And just not having the more intensive type of slavery. So another thing that kind of develops in the North is something that later burgeons into what we later know as the Republican Party. And that was a free labor ideology. That you shouldn't have free labor competing with slave labor, which we'll get into a little bit later. So as you can see by 1800, of the places that we kind of eventually know as the North, all but New Jersey, or north of the Mason-Dixon line, had abolished slavery. Now, some places had immediately abolished it, while others had like a grandfather clause, meaning that if you had slaves, you could keep them, but their children could not become slaves, and the effect was that it died off in most of the North pretty quickly. Now, New York and Rhode Island were a little bit of an exception because you had a larger number in those places. So Rhode Island's formal name until really recently was Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. Kind of indicating that like you had plantations in Rhode Island. And you did have more slaves in New York. New Jersey is the last one in the North, as you can see, to abolish slavery. And now, if you notice there, this is before the Louisiana Purchase, that what we kind of know as the Old Northwest, slavery was banned there by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So basically north of the Ohio River, in the country after 1780, is the country that we know after 1783, up to 1803. you had slavery was prohibited. So as you can see there, it's basically the states that we know today of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, and a small part of Minnesota. Now, slavery starts outside of legal structures, but many of the colonies eventually adopt slave codes to have at least minimal standards. Now, that sounds good, but you have to think of it this way. All right, we have these slave codes. Well, who the heck's going to enforce it? I mean, is a slave just going to be able to go to a county official and say, I'm being mistreated? No. It's something that you kind of have to leave up to the individual slave owner, which is not a great system. Our American Revolution. Colonies declare independence in 1776. Now, before this, there had been tensions between Britain and the colonies following the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. And in fact, during this period of time, the first actual casualty, as we know, kind of American independence was Crispus Attucks, African American, the Boston Massacre. Now, the Declaration of Independence was basically silent on slavery, and there's a reason for that. And, the reason for that was that, if you're going to unite all of these colonies, well, some of them like slavery and some of them don't. Some of them, it was basically part of their economies. So, you just kind of look, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, not everybody, So, one of the things, the reason that the French and Indian War had created tension was that it had cost Britain a lot of money to finance this war. And, a lot of the beneficiaries of that were the British settlers in British North America and Canada. So the British are thinking, well, we've got all these people over there. Maybe we should tax them a little bit more, try to get some of our money back. They didn't like that. They'd kind of been governing themselves, kind of hands off for a while, and now Britain is sort of, trying to put a little bit more of the screws to them. And they were kind of like, well, we don't have any representation in the Parliament. You have these royal governors and things that technically rule us. People were getting more used to self-governance. Now, as the revolution broke out, the British realized that the presence of slavery, especially mostly in the Mid-Atlantic and the South at the time, had the ability to drive a wedge. That you had folks that were enslaved, that they probably figured, and I think they were right, would prefer not to be slaves. The one thing is nobody had asked them. That's kind of one of the big things about slavery. So one of the things they posted was, we will promise freedom to slaves that join him. Many did. They were promised land. Now, after the war, one of the things that happened is that many of them, the Loyalists, left for other British territories. Now, it turns out that actually some Loyalist slave owners got to take their slaves to other territories. But a number of the slaves that had fought on behalf of the British did get to leave. A number of them were murdered or went back into slavery. Now, a decent number of actually freed slaves, and I don't know if any of you have had Professor Eagles in his Canadian politics class. I know he also teaches a course in comparative politics that probably more of you have had, but I encourage you to take the Canadian politics class. It's really, really good. And Professor Eagles is actually from Nova Scotia. And there actually is a decent size. It's not large, but it's a decent size African American population in Nova Scotia, and in some places in Canada, where those African Canadians are descendants of some of the folks that left. So a number of slaves kind of escaped. You know, where are you gonna go? After the result comes out. Now, a few actually joined the Patriot Forces, aka the folks that won, but most of the people in charge were like, I don't think we want to give them firearms. What are they going to do? When you have somebody that's a slave for a long time, you know, they probably come to not care for that. In fact, I would say the very good chance, not a very good chance, it's probably pretty much certain. So, the Patriot Forces do win. We get this new United States of America. Now, we start off with the Articles of Confederation. Now, if you've had me for Political Science 303, I've probably went into a long discussion about why they were a failure and why we get the governmental structure that we do. And with their failure, we get this new Constitution. And with this Constitution, we still know it today as a series of compromises. A series of compromises that maybe are not the most democratic. Now, some of these things have changed, but, we still today have the Senate, where if you live in Wyoming, you get the same representation as you do in Texas or California or New York or Florida, despite not having hardly any people in the state. Something that is fundamentally undemocratic. We don't have a popular vote for president, and you really couldn't have at the time for a number of reasons. They didn't even think about it, frankly. In fact, you weren't really having popular votes in the states for most electors. So a number of things. So we have a compromise that there's we have the Bill of Rights. We have two chambers of Congress. We have different powers that are given to certain branches of government, checks and balances, separation of powers. Slavery in the Constitution. There's only 3 mentions of it. The 3/5 clause. This was a big bone of contention. And in fact, because of the 3/5 clause, it allowed Jefferson actually to win the election. You're probably thinking, well, what do I mean? Well, it was the extra electoral votes that slave states got because of their slaves that gave him the margin over John Adams. So, that was a big question of, as far as the representation that you're going to get in Congress, which also equates to the electoral votes that the state has, how would you count the slave population? What a lot of the northern states said, well, okay, you have these slaves, they're your property. You're not going to let them vote. In fact, there were a lot of reasons why you wouldn't, because if somebody's literally a slave, I don't think they really have the free will to decide who to vote. It would have just meant that the slave owners got more votes. So a lot of folks in the North were saying, you shouldn't get any credit for them. Folks in the South said, well, we'll just count them as as other people. So, they ended up with a 3/5 compromise. So there was also the ability for Congress to put in place a prohibition on the slave trade 20 years after ratification of the Constitution. And also the Fugitive Slave Clause. The Fugitive Slave Clause, which was also strengthened by legislation in 1793. So, you talk about the Compromise of 1850, that wasn't the first time it was mentioned. So northern states largely are abolishing slavery. You can see that the dates that they were abolishing slavery either by state constitutions or by gradual abolition. You can see the last in the North was New Jersey. But most of northern New England, they just said no slavery. No slavery. Now, if you look there where you see Maine, and you're probably thinking, well, why does it say Massachusetts? Well, Maine was part of Massachusetts until the Missouri Compromise. So, some allowed for the grandfather clause there, others abolished immediately. But what you see is a stark regional divide, and the country was going to get bigger. So remember, in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, one of the things is Ben Franklin kind of outsmarted a lot of people, and France thought they were going to get some of their territory back. Well, territory west of the Appalachian Mountains became part of the new United States. Now, more on slavery. So Congress did take the opportunity to ban the slave trade. And you're probably thinking, well, that's a good thing. It was a good thing, but it had the effect of making slavery more lucrative. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you aren't importing slaves from Africa, now the slaves from Africa were still coming, and some of them were coming from the Caribbean, kind of in a black market. But if you're not bringing them over anymore, well, how do you get more slaves? Well, you had certain states, more in the northern part of the South, that became slave-producing states. And if you think that that does not sound like a good thing, you are right. It's not a good thing. So slaves were being encouraged to reproduce so that the offspring could be sold later. So this led to a lot of splitting up of families. So, slaves were encouraged to have large families. And in fact, some larger slave owners and large slave producers became more or less slave breeders. I know that sounds really bad. Slavery is really bad. But literally to the point where they were some places, some places were just, you had a smaller, plantation and things. You actually had some places, and I actually had a neighbor of mine that he's passed on since then, had actually visited a place that was once a museum in Owensboro, Kentucky. And I can still remember telling him the story. That literally, that female slaves were literally just being impregnated, almost like you were doing horses. And I know that sounds really bad, but some of these slave producers were literally considering it, not thinking of people. I think that's one of the big things that you have to remember when we're talking about slavery, is that whenever you're going to do this, and what we're going to see after Reconstruction, is you have to dehumanize people. You have to think of them as less than. Basically, that they're nothing, that they're property. To the point where you are literally going to try to get the biggest slaves that you can sell for a greater price. I mean, literally almost thinking about it in terms of how you might be doing in the horse racing industry. That's bad. But it is part of the dehumanization that was part of slavery. To the point where people would think of things like that to do. And this would mean splitting up families. This would mean sometimes that people would not know certain people in their family. I know it's kind of a historical revenge fantasy, but I mean, if you've ever seen Django Unchained, you know what? I don't know how accurate it was, but one of the things that you saw there was inhumane treatment, splitting of families. So there was the term being sold down the river. Um, that's probably more popular of a term where I'm from than probably up in this area. But a lot of that was kind of thinking about the Mississippi River. And Abraham Lincoln knew about this term because Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky. He was born in LaRue County, Kentucky, what's now LaRue County, and he grew up in southern Indiana, about an hour where I'm from, in southern Indiana. Probably didn't guess that I'm not from the Northeast. But as a young man, one of the things that he done is sailing down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi River, down to Louisiana. And one of the reasons that you're talking about being sold down the river was that conditions were worse as you started getting further down the Mississippi River in a lot of the areas in the Delta and then getting into Louisiana. So you also had fancy ladies, female slaves that would be used basically for sexual purposes by their owners. And let's remember, owners, property. One thing that you don't have when you have somebody is your property. They can't say no. And if they do say no, there could be very bad consequences. So, can you really ever have consent? No. No, because of the unequal power balance there. So basically that one person is all powerful and one person has no power. So this is one of the things that we see is that often a number of female slaves were impregnated by the slave owners. What happens with some of the children varies, to be honest. Most of them would become slaves, though, when I say varies. So 5 of the first 7 presidents were slave owners. We know that Thomas Jefferson had several children with Sally Hemings. James Monroe, who was thinking about, maybe this slavery thing isn't the best, comes up with the American Colonization Society. An idea, frankly, that catches on with some people. And this is actually something that a number of people talk about, when you're talking about during the Civil War and afterwards. That maybe what we should do is that maybe we should repatriate people that were slaves to Africa. Well, I think one of the things that ignores is that, if you talk about, the really pejorative term of sending somebody back, how many of the folks by then that were slaves were actually born in Africa? Not very many at all. So it's the place where people were born and born into slavery. Now, another thing that you did have is that you did have a number of free blacks in the country. Was it a large amount? No. Was it a significant amount? Yes. So it was not an insignificant amount. And the further north you got, the more of a difference you had. And in Louisiana, it's just kind of Louisiana's kind of its own place. And also, you did have a number in Charleston as well. And you got into Maryland, it was a lot more mixed as far as the free versus slave. So, a number of slaves were in a position where, whenever they would do their required things, that some of the slave owners would let them, have sometimes a little bit of their own land, to the point where sometimes they would be able to purchase their own freedom. Kind of a sad commentary on things. Some slaves, sometimes their slave owners would free them in their wills. Most didn't. George Washington did. Thomas Jefferson did not. So, slaves were used, and I want to have an emphasis on used, because of the very intensive nature of a lot of the farm work. You just think about it. The slave owners are thinking, I don't want to do that. Make somebody else do it. Now, when you say make somebody else do that today, you're kind of like, well, hire somebody to do something. Maybe you'll use migrant labor at a very low price. When you're talking about it back then, you're talking about people that if they didn't do it, they can be beaten. Sometimes be beaten to death. Many slaves had those whelps on their back from being whipped. And sometimes it wouldn't just be a whip out in the field. It might be that to not only punish, but show other slaves what could happen if they don't go along. Sometimes just being tied to something and whipped. Multiple times. And not just something like, just spanking somebody. Things that are going to leave permanent scars on people. So, one of the things that I can tell you that, nowhere, and I'm not comparing some of the things I've done to slavery in any way whatsoever, but I want to show you as far as burley tobacco. So there are two types of tobacco that grow in the United States: burley tobacco and flue-cured tobacco. So it's very intensive still today. There's not as much tobacco grown today because of the tobacco settlement and a number of other things. A lot of it's more grown outside of the United States. Now, the part of Indiana that I'm from used to grow a lot of tobacco. And where I'm from, we don't say tobacco, we call it tobacco. And it's very labor intensive still today. So you have to grow the plants. And, once they get big enough, you have today what we call a tobacco setter. And you're probably thinking, well, what exactly is that? So it's basically you have this little thing on the back of a tractor that somebody's kind of feeding individual plants into that it kind of plucks them into the ground. So more intensive than where you literally had to plant each one. And then you have, you wait for the plant to get bigger, and then you chop it down, stake it, and then you have to hang it. Now, the hanging of the tobacco is something with burley tobacco that's different than flue-cured tobacco. Flue-cured is that you don't dry, you dry it a different way in the flue curing process. But I want to show you the process of chopping and staking tobacco. Now, one of the other things is after you hang it and you let it dry, you get in the fall, usually about October, and you have to take it out of you usually have a tobacco barn where you hang it, and I'll show you kind of how you actually hang it because it goes on a stake, and then you have to strip it and grate it, and then you bind it, and then eventually you take it to market. So, have I actually worked in tobacco in a while? No. As a kid, did I? Sure, that was a good way to make a little bit of money. It was not a good thing when you're forcing people to do it. Also, the other thing is it's not exactly good for your health either. So, stay away from cigarettes. One of the things is a dirty process. So, it's kind of like I didn't want to be around that. And in fact, I had a friend of mine that was used to be a union president at a tobacco factory over in Louisville. And one of the things he was telling me is that cockroaches love tobacco. And said that, you'd go in there in the morning and you'd flip the light and, the cockroaches would just scatter. And one of the things he was telling me, he never smoked either because he was around it so much, too, is that if you ever hear like a tiny little pop that, often I ask smokers, have you ever heard that? And they're like, yeah. I'm kind of like, you know what that is? It's a cockroach egg. And they're like, oh my gosh. And hopefully I have talked people out of smoking. If that's something that I helped do today, I hope I did well. So I want to show you this. This is from a fellow in Kentucky recently. Just look about doing this, and think about doing it from sun up to sundown, whenever it was in the process of doing this. And remember, you didn't have tractors. You didn't, you were putting this on a wagon, and somebody was pulling it. Maybe you had a, an ox or a horse or something. But imagine doing this in the heat, in the humidity, because you're talking about in the South. It's not exactly that. It's not exactly like a buffalo summer down there. And if you didn't do it, you got whipped. You got abused. Violence could come to you. And it didn't matter if you didn't feel good that day. You still had to do it. So let's take a look at the intensive nature of tobacco.
It's clean back here. I mean, they got no weeds on it. What's it good there? That is back-breaking. Huh? Back-breaking work. Yeah. I used to do that all night. It'll get you now. But it will wait.
You been picking cotton all your life?
Yeah, sir, all my life.
What's the most pounds you ever picked in a day?
500 pounds.
By yourself?
Yes, sir.
How much did you get per pound? What did they pay per pound for that?
Well, he was cheap then.
How much?
I just remember now, but he more than nothing.
50 cents a day, $1 a day?
Well, something like that, I reckon.
You ever pick cotton by task? You know what task work means?
No, as I never picked none by no tag.
You pick by row?
No, I used to pick by the 100. It pays for so much 100 for pick.
You ever put a rock in your bag?
No, sir, don't put no rock there. And take neither.
Never?
Never.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, we just join that trail.
What do you do when you pick it? You separate that?
Yes, and see him? See this here when it goes in, you see, it be a bowl. And then that bowl gets right then, and then it goes open, and then you pull it out like that.
Now, you get special, don't you get a little more money for picking it that way than if you just pick the bowl with it?
Well, if you just pick the bowl with it, you'll get more that way, but they don't pick it here like that. But in the city now, they tell you bring everything but that stuff. Just strip it over. See, they got gins down in the city. The up here, they ain't got no gin. Not clean that stuff. No, I don't wake none. And my knees bother me, and my back, that arthritis rheumatoid.
Yeah.
And I don't wake none.
How old are you?
Oh, let me see. 75. I'm around about 75 or 80 years old or more. I've been retired.
May I ask you what's the most amount of money you ever made in a year?
Do you remember the most amount of money you ever made in a year picking cotton?
No, I know to keep up with that. It'll sit a little bit till I didn't know. I just got get it and go ahead on.
Don't save it. Just
You had to buy stuff with it. You that's like stuff high now. You can't hardly make it now. Goes out gets a little old check and it don't hardly take care of my expenses. Time I buy my food, pay my house rent, and insurance, light bill, and buy my food, and buy my clothes. It don't leave me over $2-3.
do you live by yourself?
No, that's my wife down there.
How about your children? Where are they?
Well, my children, they off. They ain't here.
Where'd they go?
They're up north somewhere.
In the cities?
Yeah, I'm in the city somewhere.
Can we watch you pick a little bit?
Now,
Can we watch you pick a little bit?
yes, ma'am. You watch me fix though. You watch me fix it though.
So let's think about in the second gentleman there, in the picture with the cotton, not a slave because of course you didn't have video at the time. It's a sharecropper in Mississippi. But I wanted to get the idea of the intensive nature of both tobacco and cotton. Now, I want you to be thinking about that clip there as well. Whenever he says, whenever he's asked there, or where your kids? Are they around? No, they went up north to the cities, which is part of the Great Migration that we saw. And I just want you to be thinking about that. I remember, the last time I taught this in person, that I remember I had somebody that was watching the thing about the tobacco, and remember, that was only 2 minutes. They were like, I'm just tired watching it. And I'm going to tell you something. I mean, having done that, I didn't do as much of the staking there, but those darn tobacco plants. I mean, I'm probably, if some of you see me in person, I'm not that tall. They get really tall. And those things are not light. They are quite heavy, and you basically have to bring down that thing really hard on top of that stake, and then you just imagine you usually have about 5 of them on a stake, and you have to hang that in a barn. Then you have to take it down. Very, very intensive. So, the Missouri Compromise. So one of the things that had happened is in 1803, the United States gets a good deal, and they get the Louisiana Territory. Basically, the country doubles in size for not that much money, about $3 million. I don't know what it would amount to today. It still wouldn't be that much. So, Napoleon needed a little bit of money. It was kind of like, hey, the United States was kind of thinking, well, we kind of like to buy the Port of New Orleans. And hey, you want to buy that? I'll give you a really good deal. So the United States becomes a lot larger, twice as big. So they get all this territory west of the Mississippi River. Of course, the thing is, as you know, from the part where the British came originally, and then moving across the Appalachians, there were already people here. So we will be discussing that a little bit later in the semester. So one of the things that the Constitution did do as a compromise as well is that the territory that was west of the Appalachian Mountains, most of the then states had claimed all or parts of them. So some of them were in dispute. So places where, well, we'd like to have Ohio, or we'd like to have this strip of this or that or whatever. And the idea was that, you know what, you don't get that. You're going to have this thing with a territorial clause where the Congress governs this territory. And you do have the Northwest Ordinance that says no slavery north of the Ohio River. But, that's only applying to east of the Mississippi River, because that's all was in the country at the time. So the plan is that as these other territories gain population, they'll get admitted to the Union. So the first is Vermont, and you have Kentucky and Tennessee, which had a number of people that came across the Cumberland Gap into those areas. Then, what do we do? What do we do with these new areas that are west of the Mississippi River? Now, when Louisiana wants to become a state in 1812, it's pretty easy to see that it's going to be a slave state. Slavery was there before. It's growing as well as people are moving west. And remember, Louisiana was actually a state before Alabama or Mississippi, frankly, because it already had a large population. So as people were kind of looking on the map, they were thinking, okay, we'll let Louisiana go in. But then the thought was, what do we do with this territory? What do we do with this other territory? So there had kind of been this general, we're going to admit one free state, one slave state, where there's going to be a relative balance. So meaning that one side is not going to be able to have that much of an advantage in the Senate, because the Senate is 2 senators per state. So when you get to Missouri, you start looking at that map there and you think, the line had been the Ohio River, and what do we do about Missouri? It's kind of a little bit, seems a little bit north, seems a little bit south. Well, Missouri wants to enter the country as a slave state. And strangely enough, with Missouri, the area that was most against slavery was in the southwestern part of the state, mostly mountainous area. Now keep that in mind when we talk about mountainous areas, because the mountainous areas largely were they weren't great on equality or anything. It's just that those areas just didn't. Their soil and other things just didn't make it where slavery was that economically viable. In addition to the southeastern part of the state, which was which had a lot of slaves and was very pro-slavery, the northeastern part of the state was the most pro-southern, and largely that was because it was largely settled by Virginians that had moved into the area. So that's when the slavery issue really starts fomenting and coming to a head. So what do we do about Missouri? Or if you're in some parts of Missouri, Missouri. So the country was starting to splinter. The idea that we're having part of that the slave states are worried that, we don't want too many more free states. We want to keep a balance here. So Missouri gets to enter as a slave state. But the compromise was, you're going to take the southern border of Missouri and extend it across the Louisiana Territory. All the territory north would be free. All the territory south would be slave. Now, one of the things that this, of course, meant was that most of the territory in the Louisiana Territory would be, if you can just see geographically, would be free. Now, there just weren't a lot of whites that had moved into most of this area, so it kind of seemed all right to everybody. And the other part, of course, that Maine would come in as a free state. Maine was originally part of Massachusetts. That's how we get the state of Maine. Now, one of the other things that was happening was the population of the northern states were rising a lot more thanks to immigration from Europe. And when we talk about immigration, basically the early part of our immigration law was that you needed to be white to immigrate here. So since the House, even with the 3/5 clause, since the House was more based on population, as states like Ohio and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and New York and eventually Illinois and others were filling up with a lot of people, a lot of new people, that meant that they were getting a lot more representation in the House of Representatives. So the South wanted the balanced Senate. So one of the other things that helped the South is that the Senate was, the Senate had a lot of part of the seniority system. So members would serve a lot of terms as committee chairs. So this would continue into the 1970s, frankly. So what is it like to be a slave? So do we have actual audio recordings from someone in the United States that was a slave? The answer is yes. And let's listen.
But John Henry Falk may have experienced the most profound effect. He was a graduate student when he interviewed the former slaves, including the two women you hear in this broadcast. Himself interviewed just before he died in 1979, Falk was going on about how he believed in giving blacks the right to go to school, giving them the right to vote, giving them the right to go into anything they qualified for. And then he said he experienced an epiphany.
I was sitting out on a wagon tongue with this old black man and was telling him what a different kind of white man I was. I remember him looking at me very sadly and kind of sweetly and condescending and said, "You know, you still got the disease, honey. I know you think you're cured, but you're not cured. You can't give me the right to be a human being. I'm born with that right. Now, you can keep me from having that. If you've got all the policemen and all the jobs on your side, you can deprive me of it. But you can't give it to me. And I was born with it just like you was." My God, it had a profound effect on me. I was furious with him. But the more I reflected on it, the more profoundly it affected me. And I realized this was where it really was.
Tell you the truth, when I think of it today, I don't know how I'm living.
I remember that just as well. Look like to me, I can't.
Been slaves all our lives, and mother was a slave, sister was a slave, father was a slave.
They know nothing about reading right there. All that I know, they teach you to mind your master and your missus. Mom and them didn't know where to go. You see, after she would go, just like you turned something out, didn't know where to go.
They are haunting voices from the past, not actors reading a script or scholars reading a text, but the actual voices of men and women, Americans, who were born in slavery.
My name is Fountain Hughes. I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson. My grandfather was 115 years old when he died. And now I am 101 years old. Other people didn't have no beds when they were slaves. You all slept on the floor. Sat up here and sat up down. Just like a lot of white people. We didn't know nothing. Didn't like looking no book.
Harriet Smith, remembering what she saw as a small girl during the final days of the Civil War.
We said all that, stood on that picket fence all day long, seeing them soldiers going back to silent zones in different places. Colored soldiers in droves. Right along by our house. Our home is a two-story house, a white house.
These recorded memories were among thousands of interviews done with ex-slaves in the 1930s and 40s.
Can you remember slavery days very
Of
well?
course, I remember all our white folks, and all the names of them, all the children. Called every one of the children's names.
Who did you belong to?
Jim Bunton, the baby boy.
The results of these digitally enhanced recordings are arresting, almost unbelievable. The idea of hearing the voices of actual slaves from the plantations of the Old South is as powerful, as startling really, as if you could hear Abraham Lincoln or Robert E. Lee speak. Listen again to Fountain Hughes, who was born in 1848.
We were slaves. We belonged to people. They sell us like they sell horses and cows and hogs and all like that. Have an auction bench and they put you up on the bench and bid on you the same as bidding on cattle, you know.
Much of what these three former slaves say may at first seem unremarkable. Much of what they say may surprise and upset, and their calm demeanor is at odds with the evil and violence we associate with slavery. Here is 91-year-old Texan Laura Smalley talking in the 1940s about the outcome of a tussle between two women, one black, one white, one slave, one mistress. The mistress tried to slap the slave, but the black woman pushed her into a chair. Laura Smalley was a girl at the time, but she remembers vividly what happened to the black woman when the master came home.
But I think that old woman, poor old woman, carried in the peach orchard and whipped her. And, just tied her hand this way, around the peach orchard tree. I remember that just as well, looked like to me, I can, and round the tree and whipped her. And well, she couldn't do nothing but just kick her feet, just kick her feet. But it just had her clothes off down to her waist, It didn't have her plumb naked, but they had her clothes down to her waist. And every now and then they'd whoop her, and then snuff the pipe out on her, snuff pipe out on her. The embers in the pipe. I'm where you ever see the pipe smoking.
Blow them out on her?
Mm-hmm.
Good Lord, have mercy.
The plantation on which Smalley was a slave sounds brutal. She recalls scrambling with other children for food from a huge wooden tray, like a hog trough.
All of them, would get around that tray with spoons and eat, sit like mush or soup or something like that. And all them children get around there and just eat.
Fountain Hughes tells his interviewer about the relentless round of work for him on a Virginia plantation.
The night never comes out. You had nothing to do. Time to cut tobacco. If they want you to cut all night long out in the field, you cut. And if they want you to hang all night long, you hang tobacco. It didn't matter about your tired, being tired, you're afraid to say you're tired.
It was cotton, not tobacco, that solidified slavery, though. The invention of the cotton gin at the end of the 18th century made its processing easy, but the crop still needed enormous amounts of unskilled labor. Control of the slave and his labor through laws and regulations became paramount. Fountain Hughes talks about one of those controls, the pass system.
Now, I couldn't go from here across the street, or I couldn't go to nobody's house without I have a note or something from my master. And if I had that pass, that was what we call a pass. If I had that pass, I could go wherever he sent me, and I'd have to be back. Whoever he sent me to, they'd give me another pass, and I'd bring that back, so it's to show how long.
Even emancipation didn't truly free the slaves. Freedom freed slaves for more travail. The end of the Civil War found many cast adrift without skills and no place to go. And the Yankees who freed them weren't always seen as benevolent liberators.
I remember when the Yankees come along and took all the good horses and took all the soda, all the meat and flour and sugar and stuff out in the river and let it go down the river. And they know the people wouldn't have nothing to live on, but they done that.
The ex-slaves left one hell for another, perhaps an even more dangerous one. No longer property, they didn't have the protections afforded property.
When we were slaves, we couldn't do that, see? And if we got free, we didn't know nothing to do. And my mother, she hunted places and bound us out for $1 a month, but we didn't have no property, we didn't have no home. We had nowhere, nothing. We didn't have nothing on it, just lazy cattle. We just turned out and get along the best you could.
In Texas, the slaves weren't told they were free until 2 months after the war ended. Smalley remembers that her masters gave the slaves a dinner, and then they were free.
I don't know how the other side of the folks know freedom. We didn't know. They just thought, just feeding us, Them didn't know where to go. You see, after freedom, though, just like he turned something out, Didn't know where to go. But just where to stay. Didn't know where to go. Turned us out just like, you turn out cattle.
In the narratives, the slaves used an interesting phrase for the end of slavery. They say, when the break came. Good times, easy times were not at hand. The trials for millions of black Americans didn't end in 1865. They continued. Laura Smalley and her family became sharecroppers. Harriet Smith's first husband was killed by whites during the Reconstruction, probably because of his political organizing. Fountain Hughes went north to Baltimore and worked at numerous jobs, including hauling manure. Not an enviable job, but it was the job of a free man.
So, I think that is really powerful. I mean, just think about that. I mean, you have the voices and recordings of people that were slaves. We have a lot of written history, but we don't have as much of the oral history, just because of how technology has moved around over time. So, one thing that I would actually encourage some of you to do is to actually check and see if you have some of your older relatives that they may actually have known or interacted with somebody that had been born into slavery. I mean, I remember that my dad, who was passed away several years ago, who would be 86 this year, actually had told me that when he was a young child, he actually had somebody that was that he had talked to that was that had been born into slavery. So if you just kind of start doing the math here, you think 1865, but then you think, well, that's been a long time ago. But if you think of somebody that was born into slavery towards the end of the period, and you talk to somebody that is relatively old today, that you may get a little bit of that overlap. Now, in many places in the South, one of the things that was quite evident was that slaves outnumbered the whites. So in the plantation counties, this was very extreme in the disparity. So there were steps to prevent slave revolts. So the nation of Haiti, as we know it now, so the United States was the first independent country in the Americas. The second was Haiti. It was created as a slave revolt. It also helped that the French Revolution it happened, and there wasn't the ability of France to undo that. But one of the things is that as you could tell from the one gentleman that was talking there, he said, we didn't get any books or anything. So they were given little to no education, and one of the reasons was to try to keep them illiterate. So you often had black ministers that preached to try to tell them to obey their masters. Now, not all, but this was something that some of the slave owners thought was a good deal. Try to teach them that, okay, it's in the Bible, you have to obey your master. So the treatment of slaves did vary. So some owners had incentives not to treat their slaves harshly, some didn't. Now, the one thing is that the fact that somebody is a slave, that inherently is that you're being treated badly. It's just a degree of how bad. So there were a number of slave revolts. There was actually a movie made about one of them, Nat Turner in Virginia, where they'd actually gotten together different firearms and things, and from a armory, but didn't work out. So John Brown tried to get slaves to rise up shortly before the Civil War, but all were suppressed and dealt with very harshly. And one of the things that, as a result of some different type of slave revolts, was much more an emphasis on don't let people learn. Don't give people access to books. In fact, try to punish people if you try to teach people how to read. So slave revolts were something that was something that slave owners and others had to contend with. Look at that fine specimen there. John C. Calhoun. He was the vice president. So he was vice president under two presidents. You don't get that very often. It's not like Mike Pence was going to be the vice president for Joe Biden, from Mike Pence from my home state, who has since moved back to Indiana. He wants to make a little bit of money now since he's never been a very wealthy man at all. So one of the things that he had done is that, with the Missouri Compromise in 1820, it kind of ripped the scab off. So up to then, slavery was kind of a simmering issue. But the regional divide was growing much more and more stark. So he suggested something nullification and secession were held as rights by states. So was it over slavery? No, it was actually over the tariff issue. So President Andrew Jackson, who was a slave owner himself, disagreed and threatened to lead an army into South Carolina and personally hang Calhoun from the closest tree that he could find in either Columbia or Charleston. So he was not kept on the ticket, as you could guess, for re-election in 1832. Martin Van Buren replaced him. And he resigned the vice presidency so he could re-enter the Senate. So he stayed in the Senate for a while, though. But he believed that states had a veto over federal policies they didn't like and could secede from the Union if the federal government sought to enforce the laws. So this was known as the Nullification Crisis. It ended because Henry Clay had negotiated a compromise. So one of the things was he was a very key figure in the political system. From Jackson until the mid-1850s. And one of the things about this period is that you had both, with Jackson, you come up with our second party system in the United States, essentially, where Jackson founds what we know as today as the Democratic Party, and you have a new party that was founded in opposition to Jackson, the Whig Party. But the key thing there is that both parties had opponents and supporters of slavery. So they were kind of regionally balanced. So one of the things that meant is that you didn't have a party that was just opposed to slavery. So the country gets a little bit bigger. So you have the Mexican War really kind of exposes more scabs in the country. So Texas had declared its independence from Mexico. And one of the reasons is that Texas was kind of a sparsely populated place. And what you had is you'd had a number of whites come in to Texas, and some of them brought their slaves. And they're kind of like, well, we'd rather be in the United States. So they do get their independence. Texas, you do have the Texas Republic. And Texas is kind of like, we'd like to join you, the United States, because we're kind of, we're the United States. Well, you know what? The U.S. government for a while was kind of like, no, you're all right. You stay there, Texas. Well, then you have the election of James K. Polk, who had one of the things that he had ran on was Manifest Destiny. The idea that the United States as a country should be a country from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Well, at the time, one of the things is that, if you just look at that, it didn't quite go that far. So one of the things he had promised as far as the Oregon Territory was, when he sent it into British Columbia at the time, 49-40 or fight. So the idea that you should go to basically where the border between the British Columbia and the Yukon Territory is today. Now, eventually that gets settled by treaty and you kind of split the difference. But the United States and Mexico get into a war. Was it kind of provoked? Sure it was. It was a war that really tore at the country. New England was very opposed to the war. In fact, some folks in New England were starting to think, well, maybe we need to just not do anything to help this war. Well, what ends up happening is that it was a big victory for U.S. And one of the things that had happened before is that Texas had came into the U.S. in 1845. Well, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States basically tells Mexico, you know what, you're not only going to lose Texas, and we're going to gain the border dispute, the difference between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, which is the current border, but we're basically going to take half of your country as well. So basically California, Nevada, Utah, most of Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and a little bit of Kansas. And actually a little bit of Wyoming, I think, too. So the United States got a lot bigger. Plus you got the Oregon treaties, you get the Oregon Territory. So the United States now is mostly, other than Alaska and Hawaii and other territories, country that we know now. Now, one of the things that this means is, okay, the size of the country has gotten a lot bigger. Well, eventually some of this new territory is going to be wanted to admit it as a state. So after the gold rush, California starts filling up with new white folks. Of course, there already were people in Texas and California and other places, as we know. So California was the question was, slave or free? So by this time we have a new president. James K. Polk had ran on, I'm only going to serve one term as president. He stuck to that pledge, even though some people told him, you need to run for another term, Polk. He's like, no. So one of the heroes of the Mexican War, Zachary Taylor, who was a slave owner from Louisiana, is elected as a Whig in 1848, defeating the Democrat Lewis Cass. Okay, he's president now. All right, California wants to become a state, slave or free. So Henry Clay, great compromiser from Kentucky, proposed a compromise again. California enters as a free state. Texas gives up a lot of territorial claims, so the size of Texas, from what Texas thought it should be. So it would actually today have included parts of a little bit of Oklahoma, about half of New Mexico, part of Colorado, and even gone up into a little bit of Wyoming. So they're going to basically get to the area that they are today. You're going to ban the slave trade in the District of Columbia, and you're going to have stronger enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Clause. So Zachary Taylor said, no, I'm not going to do that. So he died. Millard Fillmore became president. The opposition was interesting. So John C. Calhoun and anti-slavery Whigs, but opposition to the Fugitive Slave Clause became really apparent in the North. You had the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin that was written. But this did act to keep the Union intact. So that's where we're going to actually finish today, and we're going to start talking a little bit about Millard Fillmore and some of the things involving UB the next time. So everybody, stay safe out there, be well. If you have any questions, please let me know.